All right. Yeah, thank you, Lucia, and thank you all for attending this session. I know there are quite a few to choose from, so I appreciate you coming to this one. So today I will be discussing quantitative methods and intersectionality, specifically talking about some tensions with regard to quantitative methods and intersectionality, and some potential future directions. So to start off with, we know that suicidology tends to find its roots in psychology more generally, which tends to be a positivist sort of paradigm, which we'll talk about in a moment. So the question that I'll kind of be answering or hoping to at least facilitate some discussion around is, to what extent can intersectionality be captured quantitatively? So to start off with, intersectionality can be defined as the theoretical framework for understanding how multiple social identities, such as race, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, disability, intersect at the individual level in terms of experience to reflect interlocking systems of privilege and oppression. And this definition comes from Boleg's paper in 2012 and sort of builds on Black feminism and other intersectional scholars who have expanded on this sort of critical theory of intersectionality in the social sciences over the past few decades. And so in today's presentation, I'm going to very briefly discuss epistemology and quantitative methods. I'll then talk about four major tensions that I see in quantitative approaches to intersectionality. And then I'll talk about the role of quantitative methods in intersectionality research and some potential future directions for the field of suicidology in particular. So to start off with, I'll cover the philosophy of science in about a minute or two, which is quite an undertaking, but I think it's important so we're all sort of on the same page with regard to what I mean when I say positivism and epistemology. So first of all, ontology sort of answers the question, what is reality? What a researcher believes about the nature of reality informs what they think a researcher's relationship is to whatever is being studied. And so the questions regarding ontology are typically whether or not reality is subjective or objective, and how people sort of perceive reality. Epistemology, on the other hand, is the theory of knowledge. What is knowledge and how can somebody know something? And so what is knowing, what is truth? These are sort of questions that stem from epistemology. And at the far right of this continuum is methodology. What procedures can I use to acquire that knowledge? And this is specifically where we get into surveys, interviews, focus groups, the data collection methods we use to obtain knowledge based on our perception of reality and what we see as our ontological perspective of science. And so I think this provides a basis for understanding intersectionality and quantitative methods. As I mentioned, much of suicidology tends to find its roots in positivism, building in clinical psychology in particular. And positivism holds that there is an objective reality that can be captured objectively and that can be measured objectively if a researcher asks the right question. And so if this is the case, then it may very well be that this positivist assumption is likely incompatible with intersectionality. As Boleg states, the positivist paradigm that undergirds much of quantitative research appears to be orthogonal to the complexities of intersectionality. I don't know that I would go that far, but I think it's definitely something to consider when we question our assumptions about what epistemology means and how it influences the way in which we're conceptualizing intersectionality in our work. What we also know is that interdependence of identity is important to consider. One's identities are interdependent and there's no single reality about the experience of one's identities. So as Boleg states in her 2008 paper, interdependence, multidimensionality, and mutually constitutive relationships form the core of intersectionality attributes that contradict the positivist assumptions inherent in most quantitative approaches. So what this means is that the typical sort of approaches quantitatively to intersectionality are not fully capturing what intersectionality is actually about. And I'll talk about some of the tensions that sort of support that point. So there are four major tensions with regard to intersectionality and quantitative methods that I want to talk about today. The first is about the nature of social identities as additive versus multiplicative. In an additive approach, we see a sort of expansion on the multiple marginalized identities theory, in which social inequality increases with each additional type of stigmatized identity. So building on sort of the triple jeopardy theory. And most studies using intersectionality, including my own master's thesis, have approached intersectionality using this additive approach. For example, Black plus lesbian plus woman equals an intersectionality score of 3. But this ignores what Boleg describes as the poignant and complex narratives about the intersections of ethnicity, sex and gender, and sexual orientation in their lives, in the lives of people who are experiencing intersectionality. In other words, it conceptualizes people's experiences as separate and summative rather than collective. On the other hand, a multiplicative approach to identity conceptualizes marginalized identities as interdependent and recognizes that their unique and interacting effects must also be considered. So it's not only the individual constituting social identities that have meaning, but it's the intersectional spaces themselves that also have social meaning, and these must be considered when we're conceptualizing intersectionality in our work. The second tension I want to talk about is how we conceptualize social identity. Quantitative research tends to view social identities as mutually exclusive, which helps to build sort of that additive approach that I was mentioning earlier. Identities, though, can actually be at the dominant, subordinate, or mixed locations of social hierarchy, and are often contextually independent. Something Shelby mentioned this morning in her keynote was the notion of code switching. And we know that these identities can be contextually dependent, and that people may experience different levels of power and privilege depending on which identity we're talking about. Identities are also simultaneous and interconnected social categories. And I think this is a point that I'll sort of drive at a few times throughout the presentation, and that it's not just the identities themselves, but it's their intersections that also matter. And so intersectionality is about both social identity as well as social position, and the interaction between identity and social position, as well as how those two are influenced by larger macro level systemic factors such as oppression, privilege, power, and discrimination. The next tension I want to talk about is identity versus experience. The additive approach typically conceptualizes people's experiences as separate or independent and summative, as I mentioned in the additive module I was talking about. But identities cannot be decomposed into single additive layers of experience. So for example, a Black woman might not be able to separate the experience of being Black from the experience of being a woman. And relatedly, people cannot identify the sole source or even the primary source of their own oppression. It's difficult to identify which identity is being discriminated against, and therefore the experience of intersectionality cannot possibly be conceived as separate from the constituting identities that make up that intersectionality. And so really at its core, intersectionality is about examining how multiple social identities at the individual level of experience are influenced by systems of power and oppression. So really there are kind of three themes to consider when we're talking about intersectionality. It's social identity, it's social position, and its experience. And all of those are informed by power and oppression at multiple ecological levels. The final tension I want to talk about is the tendency to assign rank or value to social identities. And I'm talking specifically about quantitative value, assigning numbers to social identities. And Boleg argues that assigning rank to identity is a futile exercise because we cannot assign value to socially constructed identities such as gender and race. And again, individuals can be members of both dominant and subordinate groups. So using an additive approach, some of these identities may cancel each other out and zero out. And in those models, it will be difficult to capture what intersectionality means at the individual level of experience for those individuals. And so in intersectionality, the elements of interactions between social identities also have social meaning in and of themselves, which again is a point I'm driving at multiple times here. So given these tensions, it would seem that, as Boleg stated, that quantitative approaches are orthogonal to the critical theory of intersectionality. I would argue that it's possible to capture intersectionality quantitatively, but it has to be done in a thoughtful, informed, and authentic way. And so I think the way to do that is to think about intersectionality at every single step of the research process. From the time where you're conceptualizing a study and identifying the theory that'll guide that study, all the way to disseminating those research findings in academic and non-academic settings and mediums. So some of the concepts and questions I'll be discussing on this slide stem from a paper that is forthcoming with Amelia Noroshiro at Johns Hopkins University and myself. And so when we're talking about theory and
Hey Christina, this is Bill.
So when we're talking about theory and conceptualization of suicide, it's important to shape the research question using
Christina,
intersectionality as
can you hear
a
me?
critical theory rather than a falsifiable one. So what you're trying to do is conceptualize
Hold on a second.
suicide, sorry about that, conceptualize intersectionality not as an empirical theory that needs to be falsified using that positivist lens, but rather as a critical theory that sort of guides the theory for the study. So some questions at this stage might include, how is the population of interest framed such that it reflects the intersections between identities and lived experience at both the group and subgroup levels? Another question might be, how are multiple identities understood through an integrative and multiplicative approach rather than an additive approach to social identity? Next is design. You want to select a research design that investigates the research question without pathologizing identity. Something Sean Zhou sort of alluded to in his keynote this morning is that it's not race that's a risk factor for suicide, but social oppression and discrimination on the basis of race. So we want to make sure that we're capturing those identities without pathologizing identity. And some questions to think about in this phase include, in what ways does the design reflect structural determinants rather than social identities as risk factors for suicide? In what ways does the design observe experiences of social identity across time? How does the design contextualize individual outcomes through multi-level determinants, kind of thinking about an ecological model? These are all ways to build a research design that can help contextualize intersectionality. In terms of sampling, this is maybe one of the more difficult stages of conducting an intersectionality study, but you want to determine inclusion and exclusion criteria for a sampling frame in relation to the research question and the study objective, using purposive sampling that elevates the voices of intersectional individuals and accounts for those multiple simultaneous categories. So some questions here are, how does the sampling frame identify complexities in individual and group identities? How are groups or subgroups determined and able to sort of provide enough sufficient power for statistical analysis? These are some questions to answer at the sampling stage. In terms of measurement, you want to think about explicitly attending to intersectionality using meaningful constructs that examine that interdependence of self-report measures of identity. Ideally, this will be based on prior qualitative research of yourself or of others in the field, so that people can sort of self-identify and describe their identity themselves, and perhaps using a sequential exploratory mixed methodology, sort of build on those qualitative findings to incorporate those identities into a quantitative survey. Some questions at this stage might include things like, to what extent do demographic and survey items capture both lived experience and identities as interrelated rather than discrete? And making sure, again, that you're considering that interdependence rather than an additive approach. In the analysis phase, you want to think about utilizing statistics that reflect the interconnectedness of identities and lived experience, as well as those social determinants at multiple ecological levels. So some questions here include, how does the statistical methods examine various positions of identity, those dominant, subordinate, and mixed positions that I talked about earlier? In terms of interpretation, you want to be thinking about—
Corbin.
Yeah.
Just, you're at the 4-minute mark for your presentation.
Oh, wonderful.
Just giving you a
Thank
heads
you.
up.
And so at the interpretation stage, you want to keep power, oppression, and inequity at the forefront while interpreting your results, and make power explicit in your writing. So one question here is, to what extent do the findings convey the systemic, historical, contextual, cultural, and structural contexts of the population you're working with? And finally, in dissemination, you want to consider how you're framing the discussion around your results and how you convey findings to the community using a social justice lens. So some questions here. In what ways do the findings reflect co-constructed meaning by engaging stakeholders in the population of interest and sort of interpreting those results and disseminating those results? So in the interest of time, I'm not going to cover, a bunch of questions for all these categories, but overall, building on the theme of the conference, to prevent suicide and build lives worth living, our research methods need to accurately, meaningfully, and authentically represent the communities we aim to serve. And I think engaging in some of this critical reflection and incorporating intersectionality at every single step of the research process is an important way to do that. Thank you so much for your time.
Awesome, great work. Just wanted to tell everyone, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them up here and I will read them out loud. But great job. Just good comments for you. Great presentation. Woohoo! It's a great work.
Awesome. Well, these are some resources, references, in particular in terms of analysis and sampling. I would recommend Elsa Quest and Hyde papers. They provide some really great practical things that you can do to incorporate intersectionality. But again, thank you all.